By now, if you take a look at the scholarly literature, for example, which you expect to be a little more willing to face the facts, say diplomatic history, there is a debate on Vietnam. It's bounded by two positions, what are called the doves, who say it was a lost cause, there was nothing we could have done to win the war, and the hawks, who said if we'd fought harder, we could have won. And in between those two positions, you can locate yourself. Same is true of commentary in the press and elsewhere. Well, of course, these attitudes are not a U.S. invention. Those are, as far as I know, universal characteristics of imperial culture. The British, the French, Germans. It's hard to find an exception. But we're here, and it should concern us. It should concern us not only because it's us, but because of the significance and import. We're the most powerful state in the world by far. We spend as much on the military as the rest of the world combined, technologically far more advanced in means of destruction, 800 bases all over the world, forward deployment, planning further wars, and they're imminent. We can pick them out of the front pages right now. So it's pretty serious. If we can't feel remorse or can't even acknowledge the facts of what we've done very recently, let alone farther back, then the world is in real trouble, serious trouble. Well, Fallujah is a partial illustration of this lack of remorse. Only partial, really, I think. We were all here when it took place. It was reported. In fact, it was accurately reported, but it was celebrated. So it wasn't a lack of remorse, it was celebration of ongoing war crimes. Actually, I happened to be in New York during the second attack on Fallujah, the November one. I was giving talks, but I dropped all the talks I was giving, and I just used the front page of the New York Times and talked about that. It was a very interesting experience. I urge you to go back. You can pick it up on the internet. You could pick any other newspaper, but New York Times is the most important one, considered sort of liberal. So I just geared my talks around what was on the front pages that day. Well, the attack was preceded by several weeks of bombing. The idea of the bombing was what Ross described, I guess, to drive the women and children out, so then you could say there's no civilians. So they were bombed out, except for the fact that the city was cordoned off, so a lot of them couldn't get out, and they were killed. You could find that out from the Iraqi reporters who were there, like Nirmin al-Mufti, a very courageous reporter who was published, say, in Egypt, but not here, who describes families murdered in their houses, children, and so on and so forth, the kind of thing that Ross talked about. After a couple of weeks of bombing to sort of clear out the so-called civilians, I should say that this event has resonances. It's similar to other things we know about. For example, it's similar to what the Serbs did in Srebrenica. That's not forgotten. That's a major atrocity, and we're very irate about it. The reason is somebody else did it. We're very courageous in condemning the acts of others, especially enemies. But it was pretty similar. The Serb attack on Srebrenica, which was not like this. I mean, Srebrenica had been a base for attacks on the surrounding Serb villages, and it was under UN protection. It was pretty obvious there was going to be retaliation, so it doesn't have an analog to Srebrenica. But the planning for the attack was pretty similar, with one difference. The women and children weren't bombed out, they were trucked out. So the Serbs sent in trucks who took out the women and children, the men were not allowed out, and then came the famous massacre. We tried to bomb them out instead, partially succeeding, then came the massacre. Maybe 5,000 people, as the doctors estimate, roughly, in that neighborhood. After a couple of weeks of bombing, to clear the ground, the marine assault took place. And if you look at the New York Times on the first day of the assault, you'll see a picture of the kind that I've never seen in a newspaper before. I've seen worse atrocities, but what you saw is a picture of Marines. The first target that they took was the Fallujah General Hospital. And what you see, you take a look on the front page, you see a picture of the ward in the Fallujah General Hospital with the doctors and the patients torn out of their beds, thrown on the floor, manacled, the doctors lying down manacled, and an American soldier standing over them. And that was celebrated. It was a great thing. The press explained why. Because conquering the hospital and treating the patients and doctors this way eliminated, I'm quoting, a propaganda weapon for the militants. The hospital was a center for a stream of reports about civilian casualties, which inflamed Iraqi public opinion and drove up the political costs of the conflict, drove up the cost to us. Notice it's a conflict throughout all the reporting. It's just some natural event, kind of like a hurricane. There's no agents. There's just a conflict that somehow took place, no agents. And this is driving up the political costs by the stream of reports about civilian casualties. So therefore it made good sense, according to the liberal thinkers of the New York Times, and that reflects the mentality of the places where we live. That's Cambridge, that's Harvard, and so on. It's legitimate to destroy a propaganda center which is inflaming opinion and driving up the cost to us by reporting civilian casualties. Well, there were a couple of things that weren't mentioned in the reports in the celebration of this achievement. One of them was the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions, which are the core of international humanitarian law, as everyone technically agrees, and they are applied to others with great passion. But the Geneva Conventions are very firm, explicit, unambiguous, and forceful that combatants on any side must protect medical facilities, protect them from any harm. Well, this was not only not protecting them, it was occupying, throwing the patients on the floor, manacling them, manacling the doctors under guard. So it's a major war crime. In fact, it's a war crime that probably would bring the death penalty if it ever came to an international court. Extremely serious war crime. Well, that was unmentioned, at least I couldn't find a mention of it, which makes a lot of sense, because the lack of mention reflects a general understanding in the culture of which we're a part, namely that international law is inapplicable to the United States. So there's no point mentioning it.